good morning and a very warm welcome. I'm Mike Gray, Capability and Resourcing Manager in the National Portfolio Office at HEE. Thanks for joining us and thanks for joining the NHS Project Futures Festival, which is our final day today. So I've got a great lineup for you. And just before we introduce you to the team that are leading on this session, I just wanted to give you a bit of a format for the virtual festival if you haven't joined us during the course of this week. You'll see on the right-hand side of the screen there's a panel, and that's the chat and Q&A. It's perhaps obvious the Q&A is for you to put questions to the team. You're welcome to chat and type at any point, and the Q&As, there'll be time for that during the course of today's presentation. The festival code, which I know a lot of you are pretty keen on at the moment, will be given at the end of the session. However, if you did arrive before we went live, you'll have seen that game code on the screen. Just wanted, before I sort of introduce this session, is the three NHS colleagues are going to share today their NHS integrated care system journey. Some stories, some insights with a diverse range of ICS stakeholders. This is followed by a short panel discussion and Q&A from participants, which will explore key areas of ICS integration, implementation and collaborative engagement. And the aim of this session is to aid a greater understanding of the NHS integrated care system and that participation, and hopefully connect you with others in the NHS ICS system. So this session has a wide appeal at all levels, and we're looking forward to hearing more from our speakers. We have three of those today. So we've got Ian, who joined the West Yorkshire and Harrogate Health and Care Partnership as director in August 2016. He leads on the partnership core team, which works to provide support and infrastructure to the leadership across West Yorkshire and Harrogate. We've also got Kate, who is the Digital Programme Director at Suffolk and North East Essex ICS, the East Accord Partnership and Joined Up Care Lead, and the co-author of the Digital Ethics Charter. She coordinates the Suffolk and North East Essex Integrated Care System Digital Strategy and Transformation Programme. And our third and final guest is Will, and he joins us from NHS Confederation. He joined in September 2019 and is the organisation's policy lead for system transformation. His work has involved NHS England and NHS Improvement and the government on the development of ICSs and primary care networks. So it's an absolute pleasure having you all with us today to share your stories. I'm now going to hand over to Ian Holmes, who's going to talk to you and give an overview. Thanks very much. Thanks, Ian.
Great stuff. Thanks very much, Mike. Morning, everyone. It's really nice to be with you all virtually. My name's Ian Holmes. I'm the director for West Yorkshire and Harrogate Health and Care Partnership. Mike, can you just flick onto the next slide, please? Great stuff. Thanks. So I'm going to talk about four things with you this morning. Firstly, what is an ICS? What are ICSs all about? What are they there for? What do they do? Secondly, a bit more information about the West Yorkshire Harrogate Health and Care Partnership, which is our ICS, and the way that we've evolved and the way that we work. Thirdly, I want to talk a little bit about leadership and the different style and approach to leadership that we're seeing as part of integrated care system working. And finally, a few of my personal lessons and tips, I suppose, from having worked in this environment for the best part of 5 years. So that's the kind of the summary. And Mike, can you move us on to the next slide, please? So I'm sure that William's going to come up with a more technical definition of what an ICS is in his slot, but I thought I'd set out the kind of the features and characteristics of an ICS as I see it, really. So the first point is that it's a partnership. And it's an equal partnership between the NHS, local authorities, communities, VCS organisations and citizens. And the really important thing that we've tried to create in West Yorkshire and Harrogate Health and Care Partnership is this sense of us. It's not the bit that sits at the regional level. It's all of the acute trusts, all of the local authorities, all of the GP providers, all of the VCSE partners. It's the whole system working together. And one of the things that you might have seen in the white paper yesterday is the establishment of the ICS as a statutory body. And that's going to be something that will happen as we move forward, but the sense of a broad partnership of those partners working together is going to be really, really important. Secondly, and really importantly, the ICS exists to support collaboration. And we talk about working on the right issues, on the right scale and with the right partners. And this is about improving people's well-beings, outcomes, services and system finances. So we exist to support organisations to work better together to integrate services. And this is very much a move away from kind of a competition as a driver for improvement towards collaboration and system working as a driver of improvement. We operate a model of distributed leadership in the way that we work. So what this means is that there's not one boss of the ICS. There's 28 organisations in our case, 28 leaders of systems who are all leaders of the ICS too. And they increasingly hold each other to account for how we deliver collectively. So it's a partnership, not a hierarchy. Fourthly, ICS's work on the principle of subsidiarity. What that means is that you do the work at the right geographic level, as close to people and as close to the issue as possible. What this means is that the vast majority of the work that we do is at neighbourhood level, 30 to 50,000 people, and at place level. And the ICS working is the exception rather than the norm. Currently, and this is about to change, there's no legal footing for ICSs. You'll not see the word integrated care system in the 2012 Health and Social Care Act. And up to this point, it's been a collaboration of the willing, and the ICS has been the servant of places and organisations. That legal footing is going to change as a result of the legislation that was announced yesterday. But this ethos of collaboration and partnership and going with the energy of the organisations in the system is going to be really, really important as we move forward. And finally, clinical leadership, citizen involvement is a really important feature of all our work. It's this broad sense of partnership and collaboration. Do you want to move me on, Mike? This slide's really important, and it really captures what we're trying to sort of achieve through ICS working. So this diagram that we've got on the left-hand side of the slide is often how NHS hierarchies work. So it's a slightly simplified model, but it gets the message across. So you've got NHS England, NHS Improvement at the top as the national body. They tend to tell ICSs what, one model is they tend to tell the regional ICS what to do. The ICS then delegates to either places or to provider collaboratives. And this feels like very much a kind of a hierarchical performance management chain where you've got a national body telling regional bodies what is important, and then regional bodies telling local organisations what's important. That's not how we see ICSs working in future. And the right-hand diagram sort of tries to describe how we see the West Yorkshire and Harrogate Health and Care Partnership working in future. So the first thing is that we see it being much more of a two-way relationship between the ICS and the national bodies, a kind of a more of an equal partnership. And that feels how it's working in North Eastern Yorkshire region at the minute, and that's something that we want to maintain and continue. The second point is that the ICS is actually the large purpley coloured circle there, not the small blue one. So the partnership is all the partners. In West Yorkshire and Harrogate, we'll have 5 integrated care partnerships, 5 places. And the statutory ICS, which is a sort of the small circle in the middle, will work really closely in a mutually accountable way with those 5 places. And that whole thing is the ICS. And I guess this is one of the things that we need to be mindful of and guard against as we move beyond April 22, where we don't want to create something that feels like a traditional hierarchy. We've got a model of working, which, as I've said, is based on distributed leadership, mutual accountability, and a model of improvement rather than performance management. And that's going to be really, really important to hold on to as the ICS model evolves. Do you want to move me on, Mike? So I just want to talk a little bit about how things work in West Yorkshire and Harrogate. We're quite a large ICS and quite a complicated ICS. So we're around about 2.7 million people, around about £5 or £6 billion of health and care spend, We've got 8 councils, 6 CCGs, 6 acute trusts, 4 mental health and community providers, and a lot more numbers down the left-hand side that you can see. It's a big patch, and it's a complex patch. It's also a really diverse patch. So these bits in the north are kind of rural North Yorkshire, where you've got quite affluent but very dispersed populations and real issues around access to services and sustainability of services. The block to the south is West Yorkshire, where you've got a real mix of populations, demography, ex-mill towns, ex-mining towns, and actually thinking about how you work across that sort of scale and that complexity is really important. And that's why, again, we've thought a lot about this principle of subsidiarity and what work gets done where, which leads me on to the next slide. And so hopefully you can see the words on that, but this describes how we join up services at different geographic levels, and the bit in the middle is important. This is all about how we join up services so that people are at the centre of what we do. And the first part of this is how we join up services in neighbourhoods and communities. The left, the sort of the top left kind of part of the circle. This is really about general practice, social care services, community mental health services, acute services working much more closely together to wrap services around people. You'll have heard of primary care networks. They've got a really important role to play within that. We've got 56 of those across West Yorkshire and Harrogate, and this is for me, this is where real integration happens, and the partnerships that we're trying to build with neighbourhoods to join up services in those ways. The second kind of lens of collaboration really is the sort of the pale blue one. We've got 6 places in West Yorkshire and Harrogate. In those places, you've got local authorities, CCGs, and in future, the sort of the locality parts of ICSs, providers, working much more closely to join up services, in place, rather than having competing organisational plans. In those places, you'll have a single plan that the different, parties contribute to. In doing that, we'll put a much stronger focus on inequalities. We'll put a much stronger focus on some of the wider determinants of good health, including employment and housing. And these kind of sort of place sort of units of planning are going to be critical going forward. And then finally, we talk about the work that we do across West Yorkshire and Harrogate. We've got 3 tests for whether we do work together at West Yorkshire and Harrogate. The first is do we need to work at West Yorkshire and Harrogate level to achieve critical mass? So for services like cancer, complex mental health, you actually need to plan services at that footprint in order to get the best outcomes. The second is, is there an opportunity to use the ICS to share good practice? The NHS is traditionally brilliant at innovating, not very good at adopting, and can we use the ICS as a kind of a vehicle to support that spreading and sharing of good practice? And thirdly, are there any wicked issues where putting our collective leadership weight behind is likely to get a better outcome, and can we amplify some of those important issues into the national conversations by collectively sort of speaking with the same voice on those issues. This point around we will hold each other to account for delivery of our shared plan is really important. We want to be a system that is challenging and ambitious for ourselves and of each other, and this concept of how we hold each other to account is going to be really important. I think beyond April 2022, we've started experimenting with the local government association model of peer review as a way of getting into that, and we see that as an important point of how we'll have a kind of an improvement kind of led culture as we move forward. These are 10 of our big ambitions. So as all ICSs did, we published a strategy last year, which set out kind of what was important to us. I'll not go through those in a huge amount of detail, but I guess we put that up because it reflects the breadth of our ambition. So you'll see the first 3 objectives are about tackling inequalities and injustices that exist in society and the work we tackle those inequalities. The next 4 are about improving services and improving quality of health and care services. And the last three are much more about sort of wider societal issues and the role that we want to play in those wider societal issues around tackling racial inequality, our contribution, the NHS contribution to the climate emergency and climate change, and the really critical role that the NHS will play in terms of the economic recovery and how we come out of the sort of the COVID period with a stronger economy. So just put that up there because it's, this isn't just a kind of an NHS partnership. This is a partnership of health and local authorities, and these issues are all really important to us collectively. We've got a set of leadership principles that guide the do. Moving on to the leadership piece now, those are those 5 things there. We agreed these back in 2016 when people didn't really know what STPs were and there wasn't a huge amount of support for working as part of an STP, but we felt that these were a really set of kind of important things that bound us together. So the first one is that we've just lost a slide there. Thanks. We'll be ambitious. We can all agree that we want to do the best we can for people who live in West Yorkshire and Harrogate and the staff we employ. The second one is that the partnership belongs to us. It doesn't belong to NHS England. It's not a national thing, them telling us what to do. This is our partnership and we want to make it work in a way that makes sense to us. The third one is that we'll do the work once. This isn't another sort of tier within the kind of the NHS hierarchy, and we'll not duplicate systems. We'll use the existing systems that we've got. Fourthly, and really importantly, we'll undertake shared analysis of problems wherever we can. We'll not line up teams of spreadsheet warriors, analysts to come up with their right version of the truth. This is about having a shared analysis. We may not agree straight away on the action that's taken, but that point around shared analysis is really important. And finally, subsidiarity applies in all that we do, and I've spoken a little bit about that previously. Can I move us on, Mike? We've done a lot of work with a chap called Myron Rogers, who's a kind of an independent sort of leadership and OD sort of system thinker, and he's got these maxims which we use all the time, like literally all the time in the work that we do, and they sort of guide the way that we develop our work and the way that we think, really. So the first one is people own what they help create. So this creating this sense of an us in an ICS is just hugely important. And we've spent an awful lot of time when we've developed our way of working, our strategy, our kind of governance structure in working with all parts of the system to engage with them on that, to understand what they want and what works from them. Because if you engage people, and give people an opportunity to kind of have a stake in what you're creating, they're much more likely to work with it and own it themselves. And this sense of ownership is hugely important for the ICS. Real change happens in real work. Again, we talk a lot about structures and systems and governance. This is about transforming services on the ground so that people who are receiving those services get a better outcome and a better experience. And the way that we engage clinicians and communities and VCS organisations in doing that is really, really important. And on a similar kind of vein, people who do the work do the change. It doesn't happen from me in an office in West Yorkshire somewhere. It's frontline staff getting engaged and getting involved and leading that change themselves. Connect the system to more of itself. I think this is fundamentally what ICSs are about. The role of an ICS is to join parts of the system up with themselves so we can collaborate effectively. Finding ways to do that, again, is really important. Start anywhere, follow it everywhere. We spent a lot of time at the start kind of thinking about what the end state for an ICS was. And we realised quite quickly that that was a complete waste of time because you can't define the end state. What you need to do is start from points of agreement and build out from those points of agreement. And you know that you're heading north. You may not end up in Edinburgh or Glasgow, but you're heading in that direction. And as long as you're sort of comfortable with not knowing the specific end state, that can be quite liberating in terms of helping the way that you think. And the process you use to get the future is the future that you get. So design it in a way that gets towards the outcome that you want. Just got one more slide, Mike. which is just some kind of personal lessons from having done this for 5 years, really. So working in a system is different from working in an organisation. It's hard. You sometimes get the sense that you don't belong to anyone, and it's challenging. But once you start getting the gains, it's hugely rewarding. So you kind of need to stick with it, really. The ICS is a partnership. It's not a program. You can't program manage the ICS because it's so vast and it includes all the organisations within. You need appropriate and kind of proportionate governance in relation to the sort of the transformation programs, but the ICS is the partnership. It's all partners. Spend time on bringing people together, building relationships, building trusts takes a lot of time, and that role and bringing people together is really, really important. The informal relationships are as important as the sort of the formal stuff as well. This is about relationships, and we say a lot in West Yorkshire, you need good relationships, you also need good governance. It's not either or. System working is really complex, and it's never a linear progress. It's often 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It's often you get stuck on things and you need to work around it and focus on other things. And it's just dead important to go where the energy is and kind of not be sort of disheartened by the fact that, some things are stickier than others. And this expression was one that I learned from a colleague who I interviewed a few weeks ago, this concept of benign bloody mindedness. You just need to have a kind of a resilience and be able to just keep on going despite the fact that it's complex and that progress isn't always linear. So I'll stop there, Mike. I think I've just got one. Yeah, thank you. That's our Twitter handles if you want to follow us, and really happy to take any questions or comments on that.
That's great. Thanks so much for sharing that, Ian. There's been lots and lots of people joining in the conversation, and lots and lots of questions coming out from this. So I think people have found this really, really useful. I'll go straight into questions. We've opened this out to Ian, Kate, and Will because they're all looking at this from slightly different perspectives. We're not able to go through all of these questions, but let's see how we go. We'll start from the top because people have been voting on these. A question for either. Feel free to chip in, and we'll go around it. So, have the ICSs been designed to share and collaborate project expertise as well as clinical experience across a region? There's a sort of add-on to that. How will expertise, resource, learning, etc., be shared from a local to regional level? Anyone want to take that one to start off?
Do you want me to have a crack at that?
Absolutely, Ian. Yeah.
So I don't think they have been designed in that way. I think what we've got there within West Yorkshire and Harrogate ICS is a set of program leads, program directors who have just got an awful lot of kind of skill and ringcraft now, I would say, in working in this space, and they work brilliantly together as a group. They meet on a daily, weekly basis. They talk about what works, what doesn't. A lot of the challenges that I've described, I'm sure, resonate with on this session too. And so they've almost formed a kind of a community of themselves. It's not more formal at this part, and I think it's a really good point that there might be something about finding ways to share some of those experiences more widely. But it has happened quite organically in our system, I'd say.
Great, thanks, Ian. Kate or Will want to chip in on that one? Anything you want to share?
Yeah, I'll say on that to some extent, yeah, I agree with Ian. No, they've not necessarily been designed in that way. But what I would say is that one of the benefits in which they have been designed is that they've been designed really with flexibility in mind. So there's no one formula for every ICS, for every place-based partnership, for every PCN. The whole point of ICSs thus far, and certainly what's quite reassuring is that this is reflected in the legislation that's just come through, is that it's up to local areas, it's up to places, and ultimately it's up to systems to create the mechanisms within themselves to help facilitate that sharing of ideas, sharing of best practice. So what I imagine in future is that that's going to look very different between different systems. And I think actually, to be honest, that's to be encouraged rather than having a kind of set formula that's set at national level.
Interesting. Thanks, Will. It's interesting that Ian talked about systems thinking, and Myron Rogers. We launched the apprenticeships yesterday, and one of those is an MSc Level 7 apprenticeship in systems thinking. And from what we've understood of the appetite for that in the NHS as a whole, it's it seems to be a very popular area of interest for people. So. And as Ian described the ICS and that whole sort of system process from top to bottom, and how the system can work more collaboratively, I think that'll be one apprenticeship that could perhaps do some good in the ICS area. Okay, well, I'll take another question here, if that's okay, before we move on to Kate's presentation. How do you share best practice between different ICSs? Is there something that works for you? So from a national level rather than just a regional level. So looking at it from sort of a national perspective.
I'm happy really just to step in on this one, Mike, actually, because to be honest, I'm here from the NHS Confederation, and that's exactly what we're trying to do, is help share those case studies, those examples of best practice. So I think that something that Ian said in his presentation is absolutely bang on, which is that across the NHS, we've got fantastic innovators across the country, but what we don't have is very many copiers. And I think that one thing that's going to be crucial over the coming years is for ICSs to learn from others where it's working effectively. And I think there's many examples that Ian's just showcased from his system. And I think in future, hopefully organisations like us are going to allow systems, firstly, to share ideas and to showcase where partnerships are working effectively on the ground, but also to demonstrate to NHS England and the government, this is where it's working well and this is where we need more support. So I'm hoping that us as an organisation are going to help on that front. But it's a good point that there needs to be that sharing of ideas as much as possible.
No, that sounds great. Well, I'll take one more if that's okay, and then we'll move on to Kate's presentation. Interventions, because Ian, you touched on interventions in one of the infographics you shared, but what interventions are put in place to address health inequalities? How effective has that been so far, and how do projects contribute to that in your eyes?
Yeah, so I mean, we've got specific programs of work that look to tackle inequalities, and there's a whole range of things that we're doing. And obviously, this was a massive issue before COVID. It's an even bigger issue now. So I guess for us, the opportunities of ICS is to stop kind of the inequalities work starting with the NHS, really. So we do some really interesting work around the relationship between health and housing, the benefits of good housing, sort of the relationship between homelessness and poor health, and the role that the ICSs have to kind of address those things. I've mentioned the work that we're doing around economic recovery, and what's really important for all partners in West Yorkshire and Harrogate is that the economic recovery is fair economic recovery. Do you know what I mean? So it's about equitable growth, and our public health colleagues are really well connected into the West Yorkshire economic recovery plan, so that there's a public health kind of angle on that, and so that we're ensuring that it's a equitable approach. Employment, and the NHS is the term anchor institutions. The NHS is an employer, and a fair employer of people regardless of their background is something that we're working on, which is really, really important as well. So there's a whole range of things. I guess the difference with the ICS is the collaborations we've built across NHS and local authority is that it makes it much easier to get into these kind of wider social determinant sort of questions than the NHS has been able to do previously.
Is there somewhere, Ian, just adding to that, where people can get connected, and you've talked about an example there, but how do people get involved? Where do they hear about these things, and how can they contribute?
You mean in West Yorkshire, or I mean,
just West Yorkshire as a
So our website's great. If you follow that Twitter handle, go to our website. There's loads of information on there. We're a really, really open bunch. So if folk want to get in touch with me, or get in touch with the team through the website, they can do that. There's an awful lot of information that we communicate out as well weekly from the ICS in terms of the work that we're all doing and what's happening this week. and opportunities for people to engage that way as well. So, you know, go on the website and drop us a line. But like I say, we've got a very open door, and you know, we're always
brilliant.
Well,
you heard it direct from Ian. Drop him a message and get involved. That sounds fabulous, and that's exactly what we need, I think, at the moment. So thanks very much for that, Ian. Right, okay, so we're gonna move on to the next presentation from Kate, who's going to talk a little bit about digital and collaborative delivery. So welcome, Kate, and thanks very much for taking part today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Mike, and delighted to be here. Hi, everyone. As it says there, I'm Kate Walker. I'm the Digital Programme Director for Suffolk and North East Essex Integrated Care System. Now, I've actually been in that role for about 4 years. I moved over to that space when STPs were forming, having just written the Suffolk and North East Essex Digital Roadmap, which was all about how we worked collaboratively to break some barriers down around using digital and data technology to improve outcomes for people that we serve. But one of the things that I found really difficult when I moved over to that space, I'd been a CIO for an organisation, I'd worked in our patch for a long time, found it quite difficult that we were looking to break down some barriers, but it didn't feel like we had necessarily the levers and opportunities to do so. So I'll be honest, in the first year I found it quite challenging, rocking in the corner trying to work out how to actually find the right hooks to enable digital transformation at scale and pace. And what I was able to work out was that rather than focusing on the things that we can do, similarly to Ian's presentation, how might we collaborate to break down the barriers that are the really wicked problems? What are the really wicked problems? If we can break those barriers down to enable technology and information to flow more easily, might we stand a chance of serving the people in Suffolk and North East Essex better? Now, quite quickly, we worked out that, you know, having a guiding principle, we will develop an information sharing environment that improves the lives of people, was a better sell than we will put technology in place that makes things easier. But of course, you've got to live in a world where you have fit for purpose technology. So you need digital maturity to be able to enable an information sharing environment. And what I was able to work out in the early days was, although Suffolk and North East Essex is an STP and this area of about 1 million people, and it was made up of all these partners, 100 GP practices, hospitals, local government, organisations, pretty much every single organisation bounded into another ICS. And we were able to work out really quickly, there's actually no edges to all of this. Patients and staff, they move around. So how might we develop an information sharing environment, and how might we use the strengths and the collaborative approach that an integrated care system takes to break some of those barriers down? So focused in, these are the 4 major barriers that we came across, and you probably recognise them in your own areas. So silos, data, tech, people, they cause barriers to achieving this. Capacity and capability. There was a question earlier about how do you develop the skills to be able to work in this system space. It's messy. Capacity and capability is a challenge as well in technological development. Sometimes we see misaligned incentives and penalties where organisations are required to go in a particular direction, and that causes conflict locally. And of course, we really want to encourage subsidiarity and making a difference for the people we serve. And sometimes we've seen tribalism or protectionism about some of the technologies. These are mine, and I'm not sharing them with you. And of course, this is the integrated care is all about being able to use the resources we have for the best outcomes for the people we serve. But what we're able to suss out quite quickly is that's all very well and good, but fundamentally, this is about trust. Trust is really crucial in any enabling program in this way. So we have a few key principles. Start with why. So Simon Sinek approach, but start with why is the outcome-based approach we adopt. Why are we wanting to change? Now, I'm a technologist. I love to leap to the how are we going to do it and what we're going to do, but having a cohesive agreement with all partners and all perspectives on why do we need to change is so important. And the approach draws on quantitative and qualitative measures to make sure that we're focusing in the right area, and co-production with a broad range of stakeholders. That's quite interesting and challenging, as well as really enlightening. So let's just go back to digital. So this is how I explain. Digital transformation is an enabling action to support integrated care systems to deliver the better outcomes for people. But understanding what digital is in the context of a system is important. So in my mind, it is digital infrastructure and it's digital transformation, and they're linked together by the use of data. Data is the key thing here. And of course, we've all modernized our digital infrastructure at greater or lesser extents, and we've all tried to use that to transform, but of course, it's a cyclical model. digital. If you've got fit for purpose IT, you can start to transform the way your pathways work. But if you're focusing all your energies on transforming your pathways and your technology is not good enough, you're going to struggle. So those digital maturity elements work hand in glove. And that's understanding that to digitally drive change through an integrated care system recognises maturity on two levels, as an organisation and as a place or a system. Now, thinking about those two things, you need to, I suppose, I think about these as how do you drive those maturity areas up? So digital infrastructure tends to focus more or less on an organisational level. It might build up to a place or an integrated care system or even a region. But it needs things like security controls and audit, systems management, data management, and connectivity access and tools, the kit you use to get into the systems you need. And all of that tends to be underpinned by platforms. That's one arm of this. The other arm is the point I think Ian was making, is the digital transformation has to, rather than think about organisations, actually put the person at the centre. So person-centred transformation with people, place and practitioner act around them is how we think about it in Suffolk and North East Essex. And the four tenets for this are data fluidity, the ability for information to be reused, accessible, meaningful, remote and virtual care. We've all seen the rise of that through COVID. Such importance around digital literacy. It's all very well having technology and tools, but can you make meaning from them? Can you use them to improve outcomes for people? And automation and interoperability. All of these are different types of tenets, but if we think about people, place and practitioner at the centre rather than the organisations, what we're really doing at an ICS and a place level is thinking about the culture, the leadership and the governance, rather than necessarily the delivery pieces of work. So that's how I kind of think about, and that's, you know, I was struggling in that world over the last 2-3 years. How do I affect change in an integrated care system? So again, we started to hook on this idea. So this is a really digitized organization, very digitally mature hospital, let's say. There's lots of different components around that, and that's brilliant. Not all organizations are that digitally mature, but this is the journey we're going on. So we're trying to move to this space where the person's at the center and the capabilities wrap around them. Now that's a big shift. That's the transformation piece. It's thinking about it differently. So I just want to reflect on, I suppose, as I said, I've been a CIO. I've worked in the health and care system for about 20 years, and effectively, digital is all about change. We all know that it's much more than the tin and the wire. And this is Kotter's curve, change curve. I've spent most of my career in that kind of denial, frustration, depression space, trying to talk people into that enthusiasm level and the decision. And that's been quite challenging. It can feel like pushing treacle uphill. But I want to reflect on COVID. And I've got a little diagram here because we all experienced the impact in February and March last year and continuing, and digital really rose to the challenge. This is a diagram from a colleague of mine, Paul Fleming. Thank you very much, Paul. But this is kind of the COVID digital change curve. It started with what the hell are we going to do? It moved into acceptance very quickly. It was a case of, is it ready yet? And then, wow, can we do more of this? And that happened in 6 weeks. And in my 20 years of career in the NHS, I've never seen anything like that before. It was a cultural shift. And it was fundamentally because we removed some barriers. We had common aims. We made things easy and useful. And there was an acceptance of good enough for right now, and we know we're going to improve it in the future. I won't go through the many things that happened. We worked across both Suffolk and North East Essex, but also the region. I lead something called the East Accord Collaborative Network, a big partnership of STPs looking at digital transformation at scale and pace. And we all came together to address so many challenges, but it was a whole system approach. It wasn't just providers and commissioners. It wasn't just NHS England. It was everybody came together because we had a common purpose that was coming at us. We enabled video consultation. I mean, staggeringly, we launched video consultations for the whole region. I remember the day, and within an hour of the launch, the first hospital had enabled the software, and within 6 days, they were operationally using live. Now, that's never happened in my experience, but having that common purpose was so important. So these are the how. That's how we moved it on. We had a common purpose. We collaborated. We made sure connectivity was good. Fundamentally, as I said, there was a leadership commitment to using digital to be able to support the people that we serve, our staff, our patients, our residents. There was a focus on why and how, and a collective coming together. We had, as I said, collaboration throughout. And there was a rapid adoption and acceptance of adoption at pace was important, and we must learn from that as we move forward. We had locally led integration. We had a locally led innovation and then a mechanism to scale it as quickly as was practicable. Lots of learnings come out of it. We've done videos, we've done an after action review with all sorts of things. But as I said, from a digital leads perspective, the barriers came down, the opportunities were presented, and all of a sudden, I think our colleagues around recognise that digital may have a chance to enable us to reimagine the way health and care should work in the future, particularly how integrated care can work. In all my experiences of all of this, I just wanted to reflect on, as a leader, this is what it kind of felt. I spent quite a long time in my career trying to become a leader in this digital space, and it looks like that, I think, from as you're moving at through your career. Actually, it feels like that. If I'm honest, it's been, and it's chaotic. And I go back to Ian's point, I think system thinking. There is no space in system thinking for hierarchies. It's about, fundamentally, it's all about relationships. It's all about that trust, going back to that trust and the common purpose that we all have, which is to improve the lives of the people we serve. We're again moving through the COVID first wave and the learning. We refined our strategy into a simple slide. Again, focusing on the why, the how, and the what. We need to make sure we are resilient and adaptable. It's taught us a lot through this first wave, and data and technology has become really, really important in how we respond. We do need to stabilise some things that we did quickly. We need to sustain the things that are going to help us move forward and accelerate some things that we didn't even know were problems until this, the last 12 months, and really highlighted those areas. I mean, to be fair, I mean, Ian talked about widening health inequalities. We've all known about health inequalities, but COVID really focused the light on this. And of course, from a technology point of view, we need to make sure that we can support the many, but also the most vulnerable in our society. And we can't just think that one size fits all. So we need to accelerate some of those. And we focus in on a lot of support for our organisations, working to support our people operating in a virtual world, really connecting our strategy to the voluntary sector strategy and finding common objectives and aims, and pooling our resources so that we could respond rapidly. That was one thing that the ICS and its collaborative partnerships across the east of England allowed very quickly. Just going into how that correlates to project management, because I guess I come from a project management background. I've led programs, projects, etc. I think working in a systems space is quite different, as we've said, than working in an organisation space. So we try to use an outcome-based accountability model to help us drive our projects and programs and activities. So we think about why, what are the indicators that we're aiming for, what are the outcomes we're aiming for our people, what's the story behind the baseline, and similarly to Ian, we have a very diverse area. What's the root cause of those challenges in that area, or do we fully understand them rather than leaping straight to the answer? We then analyse how we're going to attack, how are we going to deal with it, how are we going to turn the curve on that trajectory, establish what works. And sometimes that's testing new ways of trying things to establish if outcomes are improving. And then that leads to the what, the projects and the programs that enable those change. And I think what's important is effectively starting with why is your strategic planning, but focusing on the what is your performance management, and how do you correlate that in a world. And we're hoping that as the integrated care system program moves forward and becomes more as on a statutory footing, we can find a way to really make the most of those principles. Now, as I said, I work in technology, and all this is very good, but fundamentally technology is, it leaves a legacy. It leaves a legacy of things that people need to use after that project and program is completed. So again, really quite complex, messy landscape. So we use a program methodology called adaptive program management. It's a framework that enables you to work in a very complex environment, which has uncertainty about it, but provides guidance and structure. And I think it correlates well back to Ian's principles of how they form the ICS. Guiding principles and guardrails. And what are we aiming for, and how are we going to do it? So we envision the future. We work out the order in which we're going to tackle things. We start to make change. We start to ingrain change. But each of that cycle is joined together by the step of learning, and it's iterative and it's cyclical and it's not linear. It does provide us guidance for dealing with very large efforts that require iterative approach and monitoring. But by applying the concept of this framework, we avoid wasted work. We're making the most of the infrastructure we have whilst taking it towards the future. So for me, I've learned so much by being in this messy space. I think projects in a system world can be iterative, can be very immediate. They need to be very localized, but in fact, their combination can create substantial change and lead to what Ian described as the 10 big challenges. But we in Suffolk and North East Essex call our higher ambitions. We come together to better serve the people of Suffolk and North East Essex with our higher ambitions to make sure that we're using the resources we can in the best of our ability. Has it been easy? No, but I'll go back to the fact it's all about relationships and trust. Thank you. Happy to take any questions.
Wow, Kate. Brilliant. Thanks so much. There's been a flurry of comments and you know, just the energy and the passion that you talk about your subject comes through in your presentation, and people have really taken to that. Loads of questions as well, which is great, because you know, that's exactly what we need. And this one is already from Ian and yourself, has already stimulated a lot of questions. And I suspect there's going to be a lot of things that potentially will come out of this that we need to follow up on. I'll take one for, if I can, Kate. There's a couple of people have put questions to you. So there's one here. Question for Kate, please. How do you bring individual trust together to buy into an ICS digital roadmap when they're concerned about their own problems and IT infrastructure plans?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And to be honest, one I wrangled with in the start, trying to bring people together to collaborate when fundamentally they were created in some ways to compete. And you need trust and relationships and be able to find common ground. What we were able to do back in, to be fair, we've worked as system partners for a long time. We've got good long relationships with one another, and that's something that's really important. But what we did was originally, before even the SDP term came up, I got permission to be collaborative leader and actually not use penalties to drive behaviour. And we formed a partnership, and we started talking about stuff that we might do better together. And then we focused in on where we might have collaborative wins, you know, whereby by doing something slightly different, my two organisations both gain from that. Now, to be fair, that's quite easy to affect change when both organisations gain. Where it gets really sticky is where an organisation feels that they lose as a result of that decision. So we set a challenge within a couple of years and saying, right, it's great that we can find some win-wins. Can we find agreement on how we achieve better outcomes that might mean a difficult decision for an organisation or a harder one for the greater good? We asked people to play for their club and their country. So when you come into the collaborative space, you're playing for your country and you can reflect the need of your organisation, absolutely, and we have to recognise the statutory function of that. But how might we break those barriers? How might we do that by making decisions that are for the greater gain for all? It was delightful to see about 2 years ago, the very first one of those happened in Suffolk and North East Essex. And what it's done is it's created a bit of a tipping point, a level of confidence in one another that allows you to actually affect change. But going back to the point originally, it's a journey, and it's all about trust and relationships, constant communication and understanding the landscape, which can shift very quickly.
Yeah, lovely. That's a great answer, that, Kate. Another one for you, if I may. During COVID, did you see the strategy to be focused on user or technology deployment? Predictable behaviour of the public in the beginning of the pandemic, where some views were not necessarily user-eccentric. Have you seen changes as a result of how things have been deployed and what the strategy is for that in terms of
enormous? Absolutely, I think we all have. You know, I think the reality. I think the reality was when February and March came, I think those who had plans just accelerated them, just moved them, you know, just strove through barriers and accelerated those to help free up capacity for staff, enable people to be supported remotely, virtually. You know, it's quite black and white in that early stage. I think as we've progressed through the months, we've refined and very tailored support. For example, one of the things we've launched in Suffolk and North East Essex is a remote care for our most vulnerable programme, really focusing on the most vulnerable of our society that are not being picked up in another route, and thinking adaptively about how we might best support them in a whole system place. level. Sorry, I think I've probably gone off piste on the question.
No, no, it's absolutely fine, Kate. Absolutely brilliant. Yeah, no, that I think it's appropriate and it's relevant. So thank you very much for that.
I think I've learned a lot. One of the things we've done is so just after the first wave of COVID, many people did this, launched kind of engagement with the public through organisations like Healthwatch to really understand what their experiences were through COVID and what they wanted to keep and what they didn't. And we've now used that to develop a next stage work, engaging with the public around how we co-produce user-based design, things that are useful for people, and using the learning of experience of those rather than what an organisation believes should be that standard way of operating, so much more patient focused, but it's a journey.
Yeah, no, that's great. I'm going to ask you one more, if that's all right, Kate. This one's got the top votes.
Uh-oh.
No, so what does the shift towards ICS mean for projects and programs that individuals are working on within their organisation? I mean, you touched on project management in your presentation, didn't you? And that's your background, that's where you've come from. But what does that shift mean for the people on the grounds?
I think every ICS is different in the way they approach it. I mean, I learned quite early on, if you've seen one, you've seen one. They have different makeups. And obviously this, we'll hear from Will about some common principles that will start to move forward. But from a digital point of view, every single project is relevant to every single other one. When you start talking, you realize there's a lot of common things that organizations are doing. And one thing an ICS can do is bridge the barriers and gaps to enable communication and lessons learning in a non-competitive or not a critical manner, in a critical friend, how you can support. And of course, because we're on a different digital maturity journey, some organizations are massive and got an enormous PMO and etc. Some are tiny. And how might you bridge those skills? So I think, again, it's all about people and bringing them together, I think.
No, lovely. Thanks very much, Kate. That was great. Okay, so we're going to move on because time's against us at the moment. I'm now going to hand over to Will and share his presentation. Will, over to you.
Thanks, Mike. So, good morning, everyone. My name's William Pett, and I'm a Senior Policy Advisor at the NHS Confederation. Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak to you this morning. So, who are the NHS Confederation? To start with, some of you might not be familiar with us. We are essentially the membership organisation that speaks on behalf of all organisations that plan, commission and provide NHS services. So we represent hospitals, primary care networks, CCGs, ICSs amongst others. And importantly, we're not linked to NHS England or the government directly. However, we do work with them at a national level to support the development of ICSs. So I'm hoping that I can share some interesting insights with you today. So what I'm going to cover is the three things. Firstly, I want to outline why are we moving to ICSs. So Ian's done a really good job of setting out what an ICS is. I just wanted to step back a little bit and talk about some of the wider issues that ICSs are trying to address. Secondly, I want to talk about the context and the challenges of the new NHS legislation. So what perfect timing for this event that we had yesterday, the publication of the white paper. And then thirdly, I want to talk to you about, rather than talking too much in abstract policy terms, I want to give you some practical steps that you can kind of take away from some of what I'm outlining. So next slide, please, Mike. So firstly, why are we moving to ICSs? I want to just talk about four fairly fundamental and real challenges that we face as a country over the next few decades. So firstly, we have a rapidly aging population, and there are some rather mind-boggling stats on this, two of which are on the screen. So firstly, the number of people aged over 65, and that constitutes 2/3 of the people that are admitted to hospital. That demographic rose by 21% between 2005 and 2015, and it's expected to do so again by 2025. The other stat within that is that of that group, the over 85s is the fastest growing, and by 2066, they're going to constitute around 7% of the UK population, which is massive. Linked to that is the issue of increasing comorbidities. Obviously, it's inevitable that as people live for longer, they're going to be developing more kind of interlinking conditions. But it's not just linked to age. So around a third of all people with any long-term physical condition also have a mental health concern, such as anxiety or depression. So mental well-being really can't be considered in isolation anymore. Thirdly, all of this has a rising cost to taxpayers. So as you can see, by kind of 20 years' time, we're going to be spending around 10% of our national income on health. Partly that's because the vast majority of our health budget is spent, of course, on the NHS, and the NHS has benefited since its inception from an average of around a 3.5 to 4% increase in spending every year. Few other areas of public spending really rely on such a big increase. And this is causing real significant headaches for the Treasury. Simply put, kind of finding a sustainable way to fund healthcare is going to be a really key challenge for us as a country over the next few years and decades. And finally, there's increasing recognition of the wider determinants, which have been touched upon in the previous presentations. This idea that health services alone can't do it all. There are loads of other factors that are emerging that affect an individual's health and well-being, and you can see some of those on the screen there. So a person's income, their local natural environment, their level of education, and many others. So those are the challenges. Mike, next slide. Thanks. So these are some of the solutions then to some of those challenges that I've just outlined, and this is kind of what ICSs are going to start to help us to move towards in terms of solutions. So the first solution is actually moving services closer to local communities. So to ease pressure on hospitals, the idea is that we should be focusing on local alternatives to A&E, particularly in areas like mental health. Primary care networks have been picked up by Ian already, but they're going to be crucial in terms of employing an increasing number of non-GP staff that patients can have access to through primary care services. So those include physiotherapists, nursing associates, occupational therapists, and a range of other professions. And really feedback and research shows that local residents really value being able to access help closer to home when they need it. It helps them to avoid trips to A&E, and it also cuts the amount of time that people are unnecessarily spending in a hospital bed. Secondly, multidisciplinary team working. So to help improve care for those with often complex interacting comorbidities, MDTs bring together a team of health practitioners to discuss the best care and support for an individual. And the evidence really is clear that MDT approaches are associated with improved outcomes for patients and people who use those services. Thirdly, I want to just talk about population health management as a solution, and this is really going to be central to the vision for ICSs. Kate, no doubt, will be more of an expert on this than I am, but essentially it involves the collection, analysis, and sharing of patient data between a network of connected applications and devices. When it's done well, it can help systems identify where there is unmet need across their populations. And it's also a good way to help prevent many kind of costly long-term health conditions developing among individuals. So it's good for the individual, and it's good for the system. I also want to just quickly outline prevention and in the idea of improving day-to-day health and well-being. So I'll kind of refer you to the chart that you can see on the right-hand side, which kind of shows how population health systems aim to improve health for individuals and for populations. And you can see in the bottom right that there's a box around making every contact count. I hope you can read that and the text isn't too small. But essentially it's this idea that rather than importing illness, services should be more about exporting wellness. So this is both in regards to physical health, so ideas around, for example, prescribing exercise or referring people to smoking cessation services where it's relevant, or indeed in regards to mental health. So identifying, for example, if someone might be suffering from loneliness and using social prescribing to get them involved in local community projects. And then finally, a solution is closer working with local government. There's an increasing recognition that local authorities play a really crucial role in an individual's health and well-being. But until recently, health services and local authorities haven't really been working closely together on a kind of daily and weekly basis. And so ICSs are really hoping to foster much closer working between health services and local government. So that's why I'm moving to ICSs. Next slide, please, Mike. I just want to talk a bit about then the context of the new legislation that's come forward. Don't necessarily get too bogged down in the text of this graphic, but essentially it's just there to show you, firstly, on the left-hand side, where we've come from. So SDPs and ICSs have broadly developed according to a voluntary partnership approach so far, which has involved less statutory authority and prescription about how to develop, but rather based on kind of trust and relationships forming on a local level. We're now going to move towards what you can see on the right-hand side, which is a statutory framework, and you can see some of the elements of that in the box. Though there are some exceptions to that. That's not a perfect representation. But what I should say on this is that through our work engaging with our members across the country, hospitals, CCGs, others, we've really noted that there's been a real shift of opinion across the NHS since the beginning of the pandemic. With legislation feeling like it's going to be needed to embed collaborative working in the future. Essentially, the feeling across a lot of our members is that the fewer barriers there are to integration, the better and more flexible health and care services can be to their populations. So broadly, it's just worth saying that actually, the move towards legislation is not something that broadly our members across the NHS are worried about. It's something that actually broadly is to be supported. So next slide, please, Mike. With that in mind, yesterday we had the publication of the white paper. This is a really important moment for health and care. New legislation over the NHS doesn't come around that often. So we had the white paper yesterday, and it would have been really helpful for this presentation if they'd published it earlier in the week. I had a somewhat stressful afternoon yesterday. But nevertheless, I just want to run through a few of the kind of headlines from the white paper. So I guess firstly, it sets out some clear purposes of ICSs, and that's really welcome because until recently, that lots of people were confused about what are we actually trying to do through ICSs? What objectives are we trying to meet? So the four that you can see there have been clearly given in the white paper. And then there's a whole range of policy changes and reforms that are going to come through. I think that potentially is an old version of my slide deck, Mike, because it's moved on slightly. But I'll just talk about some of the ones that have come through in the white paper. So ICSs are going to be established on a statutory footing. They're going to be made up of both an ICS NHS board, which is going to have powers for spending and a budget, a dedicated budget, but then also a health and care partnership, the latter of which is going to bring together not just the NHS, but also local government and other wider partners. You can see there on that slide, there's going to be a focus on provider collaboratives. This was going to help to link together providers at place level, which is going to be broadly in line with local authority boundaries. But we know that there's a desire to devolve decision-making powers down where possible from system level to place. And there's going to be a duty to collaborate. So this is something that the NHS Confederation and the Local Government Association has specifically called for. So that's going to be placed on not just health services, but on local authorities. However, it should be noted that it's not clear at this stage what the penalties might be within the system. For example, if a partner doesn't collaborate, that's certainly a detail that we'll be influencing on over the coming months, and we'll want to get further clarity on. And then finally, there's changes to commissioning. So there's going to be an end to CCGs as we know them, with ICSs in future to hold strategic commissioning powers. But as I said, with devolved commissioning responsibilities being given down to place level. So next slide, please, Mike. So there's a tendency to be pessimistic, especially when you work in a policy role. But I don't mean to be too negative about all of this. And actually, it's important to remember that there's good rationale behind the legislation, as I've said. However, and a big however, is that past experience has shown us that governments often fall into the same traps when they introduce new NHS legislation, And I just want to outline some of those and just kind of detail what some of the challenges are going to be for this government as they try and get this legislation through. The first is there's a real risk of disruption and distraction with all of this. So this is the idea that managers and clinicians are going to be more focused on setting up new structures and redrawing boundaries rather than on what's important, which is improving services. And evidence from the King's Fund shows that that was certainly an issue after the last reforms in 2012. Secondly, there's potential for uncertainty on leadership and who's to hold the system to account. So there's a potential worry that in future, you will have providers, so NHS trusts, who may face this tension between, on the one hand, pursuing what's right for their own organisation and their trust versus what's right for the system as a whole. And that certainly is a tension that potentially exists in future. Thirdly, ambitious expectations. It's really important to note that the legislation alone is not going to make and do the change. It's what comes as a result of the legislation that is going to indicate how successful it is. And it's worth noting that since 1999, there have been over 20 legislative reforms, policy strategies or transformation programs that have aimed to improve integration. And analysis by the Nuffield Trust shows that very few of these have actually improved patient outcomes. So the legislation needs to be considered alongside a whole range of other changes that need to come through, including around culture, behaviours and leadership. So it's important to note that. I want to talk about patient choice quickly. So the current framework that we have at the moment is one that embeds competition between providers. But it's important to remember that this has always been intended to drive up standards and increase patient choice. And some believe that there's a risk that these reforms go too far the other way and lead to what some refer to as kind of cosy monopolies forming, which potentially in turn could reduce patient choice. And that's something that the government has to bear in mind. Finally, patient voice, although actually what I really mean here is patient and resident voice. One thing that is pretty much near unanimous across health and care is that patients and residents really need to have a voice in the direction of their own ICS and in the direction of their own local services. Health and wellbeing boards are a really important mechanism for this within local authorities. And the white paper reassuringly says that systems should link in with health and wellbeing boards in future, but it's not clear at this stage how that's going to work in practice. But those are some of the challenges that the government faces over the next few months. Next slide, please, Mike. And this really is, I suppose, kind of the ultimate challenge is for you and for everyone is kind of understanding what the future landscape is going to look like. And this slide just gives you an idea of some of the organisations that are going to be interlinking in future. So, the idea really is that effective legislation should try and simplify the environment that it's relevant to. But there's a real risk that the future landscape could be as, if not more, complicated than the current one. So you're going to have, foundation trusts, provider collaboratives, local authorities, NHS regions. You can see them on the screen. The list goes on, and that's only a handful of some of the organisations that you're going to have in the future. So clinicians, staff, project managers, to some extent the public as well, are going to have to get their heads around a complex jigsaw. Next slide, please, Mike. So I just want to kind of end by talking about how you can translate some of this policy into practical steps. Many of you will no doubt be doing these things already, and Ian and Kate will be able to give, I'm sure, a much more detailed idea of what this might look like in practice. We know in the Confederation that there's loads of great work happening on integration across the country, and to be honest, in some respects, the legislation is playing catch up with what's already happening on the ground. So in terms of preparing for statutory ICSs then, I suppose the first thing is around understanding your local health and care landscape. So understanding what work is already being done by local authorities and those in the voluntary sector, for instance. Where are all of these organisations' priorities? What are they trying to achieve? And I think that only kind of by understanding those incentives can you help to align those with your own organisational incentives. Secondly, developing trust and cooperative relationships. So as kind of Kate has already rightly drawn attention to, the success of integrated working on the ground in future is really going to depend on the quality of relationships between partners. And there's a quote, although potentially this might be a misquote, that progress only moves at the pace of trust. So where you have trust between partners, things can move very quickly. Where you don't have trust between partners, it can be a very slow and arduous process. Thirdly, I just want to talk about having a sense of, I guess, of your local community needs. Where can value be added and where can those needs be met? So a good way of assessing where there are community concerns and community needs, for example, is through health and wellbeing boards. What are local residents saying they want to be improved in their local areas, and what could be done by your organisations to address that? Contributing intelligence and ideas to system strategy. So it's really important that systems are driven by what's happening on the ground, and that ICSs in future are absolutely bottom up. But we've heard that from some of our members, getting into system level conversations and forums has been potentially quite difficult, and they've had to kind of jostle their way in. But absolutely try to do that and try to get involved in conversations and forums that are happening at system level. Finally, I just want to talk about the importance of data and understanding that. So I guess some of the questions that need to be asked are around where would data help to improve services or projects at local level, what data is missing at present, and then subsequently working with your ICS, working with partners within it to boost the data collection that's happening, and all of that will feed into kind of population health management at system level. So next slide, Mike, and that's the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions and for anyone to make comments and discussion points. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that, Will. Absolutely fascinating stuff. And there's been a number of comments about the white paper in the chat, and the fact that get the impression that the white paper is likely to accelerate some of the legislative policies, and I think people are still feeling a little foggy about that. How do you see the relationships changing due to the white paper? I know it's early days, but what's your sort of take on that?
I think, as I said in my presentation, I think the reason why these reforms have perhaps been welcomed more than others in the past is that these reforms are essentially there to be an enabler to things that have already started to happen. So we already have ICSs operating. These aren't new mechanisms and organisations that are being introduced. So the legislation really is there to try and boost what's already happening and make it easier for organisations to work more jointly. So to some extent, I don't really see the relationships changing too much, and we've been quite reassured that as Ian was talking about earlier, the idea of systems is going to be built around this idea of subsidiarity. So as much as possible, devolving decision-making powers and functions down to the most local level possible. And that's really, really reassuring for us, because absolutely what we don't want to see is moves towards yet more kind of top-down hierarchical structures, which in the past have been incredibly unpopular and haven't really worked. So at this stage, we're feeling quite optimistic, and in answer to the question, I'm hoping that the relationships aren't going to change too much as a result of the reforms.
Mike, do you mind if I come in on that question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
yeah, of course.
Really helpful presentation, William, and I agree with what you've said there. I guess one of the things that we all need to be mindful of, and we're really mindful of in West Yorkshire and Harrogate, is that you're moving away from a partnership with no accountability really or authority, and a partnership with willing to a model where you've got a jock and organisation with a lot of money flowing through with a lot of accountability. And what I think is really important in that context is that doesn't change the quality of the relationships. We've got this real sense of us and us in West Yorkshire and Harrogate, and if you make someone accountable to the centre and they've got to do some stuff that might not be popular. How do you create that sense of us and us rather than being, oh, crikey, the ICS is making us do this now? So I think I agree with William. I think there is a real tension there. I guess the other point I'd just like to come back on is this really important point around the risk of disruption, and particularly the risk of disruption to people who are sitting in a CCG and they look at the white paper and think, actually, my organisation isn't going to exist in 14 months' time. I guess one of the things that we've observed in West Yorkshire and Harrogate is that the folk working in CCGs at place level within our ICS have done a brilliant job, in the last few years around kind of providing this glue for the collaboration, the system integration role in place. And that role is going to be really, really important moving forward. So what's then important for us is finding a kind of a good sort of safe sort of place for those staff to work in, because they are going to be a really key part of the system going forward.
Thanks, Ian. That was great. Anything you wanted to add, Kate? Anything from your end on that?
No, I guess the guys have said it all. I think.
Yeah.
Although I keep going back, relationships are so crucial. The trust, the transparency. It's whilst we carry baggage where we don't trust, that we actually can't get into action, if you like. So I think it's really important that as this changes, we maintain that sense of trust, that sense of place, that sense of localism, that sense of subsidiarity, and maintain that wherever possible. But yeah, there's going to be a lot of activity alongside and run the risk of distraction. And I go back to the point I suppose I made at the beginning around capacity and capability in the digital space. If we're all of a sudden doing twice as much, we need to think about how not to slow down. And if I'm very get great feedback from our frontline practitioners that they don't want to go backwards on this agenda. Data and availability of useful tools to be able to, provide better care is really important. So distraction is a concern.
Right. Yes, that's great. Thanks.
You're on mute, I think.
Will, there's another one that's come up here. You mentioned in your jigsaw with all the component parts of those that are likely to be involved in this, the future landscape. How do we make sure knowledge and expertise isn't lost in this continuing changing landscape?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think that one thing that we are concerned about in terms of the new landscape in future is, as I said, we're moving away from CCGs as we know them. And I think that CCGs have done a really good job in many respects at holding clinical expertise and knowledge at local level. And we're now moving towards a system where CCGs are going to be abolished and subsumed into ICSs. And what's really important in that transition is that we don't lose that local clinical expertise, and that in future ICSs do a good job at understanding our local populations. It's a really good point, and it's one that we are really trying to focus on over the next few months. It's about making sure that, as I said, it's about this principle of subsidiarity. So where you have organisations operating at the most local level. So, for example, PCNs are the absolute best means of understanding what is happening at a local level and what a local community's concerns are, where there is unmet need. The most important thing that we see as an organisation is that in future, there is a mechanism through which PCNs can relay information up to place level and to system level. And really there needs to be that approach of bottom up rather than hierarchical top down. So yeah, it's a good point, and it's one that we're going to be focusing on over the next few months.
Great, thanks, Will. I'm going to open this question out. I'm not perhaps sure who's best to answer this one, but we've got a question that's top of the votes at the moment. Has any work been done on an ICS-based system PMO? And if yes, what approach have you taken to marry this with shared leadership?
So yeah, I think Ian may be best placed to answer this. What I will say on that is that we've done some work as an organisation last year around PMOs at system level, and certainly last year, towards the beginning of 2020, there were certain systems that were operating a central PMO model. So you had staff centrally held by systems who were responsible for kind of facilitating a lot of the transformation across the system. And we've kind of noticed over time that increasingly we've been moving towards what Ian referred to as a distributed leadership model, where rather than having a central large PMO that manages everything and oversees everything across the system, you increasingly are seeing systems that have people across providers, across CCGs originally, and others who are actually helping to drive forward some of that transformation as part of their jobs within partner organisations. So I think the answer is, and Ian will correct me if I'm wrong, that actually this idea of a system PMO in future might not be quite so kind of prevalent as a kind of distributed leadership model. Ian, is that right, or do you have a different view on that?
Yeah, I mean, maybe a slightly different view, but so I think the ICS needs a kind of a place that's the engine room. And when you did the piece of work last year, William, you referred to it as kind of almost the ICS engine room, which I think is a better way of describing it than a PMO. And we call it the core team. And essentially, there's probably about 8 of us in this, maybe 8 or 10 of us right in the centre of the ICS, which is our governance lead, our kind of head of kind of everything really, our sort of head of ops really, communications lead, and a few other bits and pieces of capacity right in there. And we are essentially the fulcrum of the ICS, and stuff comes through us and goes back out again. We've then got a series of programme directors who lead the specific transformation programmes. In no way, shape or form is that a PMO. It's a core team. It's an engine room. It's it's the bit that sits within our kind of ICS lead sort of, it would almost be the kind of the sort of the private office, I suppose. It's that really. And so I don't think the ICS needs a PMO, because I don't think the ICS is a program. I think the ICS is a partnership. I think what you need is, a set of functions that maintain the energy and keep stuff going. Manage that relationship upwards, manage the relationships outwards, and that's really what our core team does. And I think all ICSs will need one of those now and definitely beyond April 2022.
Thanks, Ian. You got any comment on that, Kate?
Yeah, I do, because I look at it slightly differently. I mean, similarly to Ian, we are working in ICS with a very, very small core team, effectively that engine room. And as the digital lead, I'm one of those. But within the digital programme, there's not just the relationships. There's also the management of money and distribution of money and delivering of outcomes and various other things. And just to give you a sense, every STP will be different in how they manage all of that. But being able to have oversight of where the benefits can be driven out and the actions that can be taken to improve those benefits is really important. So while we might not need a traditional organisation type PMO or that kind of thing, and you can imagine I come from technology, we always look at it from a system point of view, technology point of view. It's much less from a monolithic PMO, PPPM type software, much more about collaborative and cohesive. But I do think in the digital space, we do need that coordination and cohesion and transparency to enable those conversations to happen. Would I call it a PMO? Don't know. But the need to have that site and feeding into the discussions that are distributed leadership is important.
Thanks, Kate.
And obviously, Suffolk and North East Essex and how it spans into the work around the east of England, again, keeping that that site about we're all pointing in the right direction. It's not about a lot of spreadsheets. It's not about over monitoring or assurance. It's about guiding principles and are we going in the right direction, and where might there be challenges on the horizon that we can actually collaboratively come and fix rather than performance management. Does that make sense?
Does to me, yeah. That's great. Thanks, Kate. Nice way to end that question. And thanks for your question on that one. I've got one here. So what are your comments on the further powers granted to ministers and the SOS over the NHS? Is this a necessary step tied to the reforms?
So I was wondering if that issue was going to come up, actually. I didn't want to raise it myself because I wasn't sure it was directly relevant to ICSs, although I suppose indirectly it may be. Personally, I've got concerns about the new powers for the Secretary of State. I think that what I'm worried about well, firstly, what I'm worried about is that these powers have been justified. Some of the rhetoric that's been used in the last week have justified those powers by saying that what the pandemic has shown is that we need more government control over the management of the NHS. And actually, I think if you look at what's happened during the pandemic, the last thing that has shown is that you need to have more political influence over how healthcare is delivered. If you look at what's happened with test and trace and what a disaster that's been, compared to, for example, the vaccination program, which has been driven largely by the NHS, I think we need to let the NHS get on with delivering as it sees fit. And what I'm concerned about in future is an NHS that becomes much more influenced by the kind of whims of an incoming administration, and kind of new governments that come in and immediately want to make sweeping changes. I think, to be honest, stability in the NHS is extremely hard to come by. It's a very scarce resource, and the more long-term stability that we have for the NHS, the better, in my view. And also, I should say that the NHS is still one of the most centralised health systems in the world. I think that any measures that kind of centralise it further are to be treated with some degree of suspicion. That's my personal view, although the Nhs Confederation is also concerned and has put out a statement on that. So that's my view on the powers. Ian, I can see you've got your hand up as well.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Will. Yeah, I mean, I agree with that, and I think the point around the sort of the COVID justification for more centralism was completely agree. I mean, it was, crikey, when I read that, it was somewhat frustrating. I mean, I guess my view is slightly different in that, when the 2012 Health and Social Care Act came in, that was a thing that was meant to really sort of formally create the separation between the NHS and government. Andrew Lansley left quite shortly after that being finalised. Jeremy Hunt came in, and it was weekly meetings between NHS and the ministers. It felt like it was a very, very close, strong degree of oversight from the Secretary of State to the NHS. So I don't actually ever feel like it's, felt like we've operated in the spirit of the 2012 Act, I suppose. I think it was almost like there was those set of reforms, and almost immediately from when they were introduced, there was a whole range of workarounds put in place. And one of those was the direct relationship that, the Secretary of State for Health of the democratically elected government wanted with the NHS. And that just kind of happened, really. I think it's extremely difficult. Ultimately, the Secretary of State for Health is the one who is most publicly accountable, whether we like it or not, in terms of the way that the media and the news hold them to account there. So it's really difficult to have that accountability, but almost give up a lot of the sort of delivery. And I guess we've been in and out of this cycle for years, and I kind of see it as more of the same, if I'm perfectly honest.
What I think is that I don't think that the current structure has stopped any government really from implementing what it's wanted to implement on a health front. So I don't think necessarily that there's this idea that at the moment the Secretary of State is frustrated because they can't do this and they can't do that. Largely, governments have come in, they've been able to prioritise their health commitments in their manifestos, and it hasn't really kind of stopped governments from getting on with things. But it's things like, for example, the intervention in service reconfigurations that slightly worry me. So in future, the Secretary of State will be able to intervene whenever there's a hospital closure, whenever there's a downgrading of a hospital. And sometimes those decisions are necessary. There's good reasons for hospitals sometimes closing or being downgraded. And I worry that in future, if you have, for example, a Conservative MP who has a hospital being closed in their patch, suddenly that creates a perverse incentive for the Secretary of State to get involved and to prevent that decision from happening. So I think that there's a tension between political influence and effective decisions sometimes, and we're slightly concerned about that. But listen, we need to work out the detail, and that's something that we're going to be doing some work on over the coming months.
We're close to running out of time. I just want to ask one final question, if I can, and you can spend just a sentence on it. How can we as projects and change professionals support successful ICS delivery? How can the people that have joined this festival support what you're doing in a positive way? What little steps can we do to help with the challenges and barriers that you've described today?
happy to go first. I think for me, it's making sure the project outcomes are pointing in the right direction. One of the things we can often do with projects is sometimes hit the target but miss the point. So it's making sure those outcomes are wanted and needed and can stick, can be sustained. And when and being able to working across boundaries, working in the grey and messy edges to bring people's perspectives into that, so we're not just hitting the target and missing the point. As I said, I spent 20 odd years in my career in the NHS doing projects and trying to move forward, and it wasn't until I stepped outside and started working outside of organisations I could see why the barriers were preventing us from doing that. So we absolutely need those skills of communication, of consistency, of coordination, but I would suggest very much in an adaptive and more of a relationship manner than a project that might build a blueprint of a rocket that goes to Mars. We're growing a family, if you like.
Lovely. Thanks, Kate.
I suppose what I'll say on that is I hope this isn't kind of too blue sky in terms of a response, but I think we need to make the NHS and the health and care sector more broadly as good a place to work as possible. We went into the pandemic with 100,000 vacancies across the NHS, across a whole range of areas. And really, we need to be encouraging as many people to want to work in health and care as possible in a range of roles. So I think a very real step that everyone can take is essentially making the culture of the NHS as good as possible, as friendly as possible, as welcoming as possible, so that people actually want to work for health and care organisations. And I think that's something that is kind of on everyone, really.
Thanks, Will. And we started with you, Ian. We can finish with you if you like.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something about us as leaders placing value on system rules rather than organisation rules. And one of the challenges we've had in the past, and it's an issue for all ICSs, is that the way that they're funding and resourced has been, hopeless. Transformation funding, 1 year, you stick someone on a fixed term contract for 9 months, and and what happens at the end of that? And actually, if we're serious about system working, which we are, and I actually love it, and I think someone who's interested in strategy working in the system space is much more interesting in an organisation. We need to make these jobs rewarding and attractive to people, I think.
Absolutely. No, that's great. Thanks, Ian. And that's the end of our session together. It's been I've loved every minute of it. And from what I've seen from the chat, we've had some fantastic comments from those are listening today, including one actually made me chuckle. Will for Prime Minister. Will, someone wants you to take office. But honestly, it's been fantastic. From every comment that's come in, it's been nothing but really positive, thought-provoking stuff. Any questions that we haven't got round to, because there's loads, we're likely to share those with you and just to sound you out and maybe get a sentence or two on that. But overall, a fantastic session, and thanks to everyone that's been involved to make this final session of the NHS Project Futures Festival morning session a really productive and thought-provoking one.